Imagine being a young woman in 1062. What if marriage, the path society dictated for almost all women, was simply not an option for you? What choices, if any, were left, and how truly grim might they be? Number 1. Entering a convent. In the 11th century, the world was steeped in devotion. Church was not merely a building. It was the very framework of society, the keeper of knowledge, the dispenser of spiritual grace, and a powerful landowner. For some women, particularly those from noble or wealthy families, the convent offered a sanctuary, a place of peace, and perhaps even an opportunity for learning that was denied to most women in the secular world. For many others, entering a convent was not a heartfelt calling, a passionate yearning for a life dedicated solely to God. Instead, it was often a stark necessity, a path taken when all other avenues to a respectable and secure future had been closed off. This was a grim choice because it represented a profound renunciation, a severing of ties to the world and its joys, not out of spiritual ecstasy, but out of a desperate lack of alternatives. Consider Elara, perhaps a second or third daughter of a minor lord, or even a prosperous free farmer. Elder sister had already secured a good marriage, bringing a desirable alliance and a dowry that had strained the family coffers. When it came to Elara's turn, there simply was not enough wealth to provide her with a suitable marriage portion. Dowry, which could include land, money, livestock, or valuable goods like textiles, was essential for a woman to secure a husband of her own social standing. Without it, she became a burden, a drain on her family's resources, an unmarried female occupying valuable space and consuming food without contributing in the expected manner. Marriage was the primary economic transaction for women, ensuring lineage, transferring property, and cementing alliances. Without a dowry, the very mechanism for her future was broken. So the discussions would begin, not with whispers of suitors, but with solemn pronouncements about Elara's piety. Parents might speak of her quiet nature, her fondness for prayer, her suitability for a spiritual life. These were often convenient fictions. The reality was that a convent offered a respectable solution for an unmarriable daughter. It removed her from the household, absolved the family of the responsibility of her upkeep, and often required a significantly smaller payment to the convent than a full marriage dowry. This payment, often called a karate, secured Elara's place, ensuring her food, lodging, and spiritual care for the rest of her days. While it was a financial transaction, it was cloaked in the sanctity of religious devotion, making it socially acceptable and even laudable. Life within the convent walls was disciplined, structured, and profoundly different from the secular world. Elara would have taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Her days would be governed by the ringing of bells, marking the hours for prayer, communal meals, and work. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, the rhythm of the monastic day was relentless. She would spend long hours in the cold chapel, chanting psalms in Latin, a language she might barely comprehend beyond the rote memorization of the liturgy. The silence was often profound, broken only by hymns, the rustle of habits, or the quiet murmuring of prayers. For a woman who entered the convent not from choice but from necessity, this life could be incredibly challenging. Imagine leaving behind the familiar smells of your family home, the chatter of siblings, the warmth of the hearth, for the austere, often drafty stone corridors of the cloister. The rough wool of her habit, the simple meals of bread, pottage, and perhaps a little fish or cheese, the communal sleeping quarters, all would be a stark contrast to any life she had known. Her hair, once a symbol of her femininity and allure in the secular world, would be shorn, hidden beneath a veil and wimple, erasing her individual identity in favor of her new spiritual role. Her name might even be changed, further signifying her rebirth into the religious life. The work of a nun was varied. Many convents were self-sufficient, requiring the sisters to engage in manual labor. This could include tending to the convent garden, growing herbs for medicinal purposes or vegetables for their meals, or raising animals. Nuns were often skilled at spinning, weaving, and sewing, producing textiles for their own habits or for sale to support the community. Some convents were centers of learning, where sisters copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, or taught young girls from aristocratic families who were sent there for education before their own marriages. If Elara was fortunate enough to be in such a convent, she might find solace in the quiet scholarly pursuits, the beauty of the written word, and the intellectual stimulation that was otherwise inaccessible to women. However, for many, the days were filled with mundane, repetitive tasks, offering little escape for the mind or spirit. One of the greatest challenges for a woman who entered the convent without a true vocation was the suppression of her personal desires and emotions. The vow of chastity meant renouncing any possibility of love, marriage, or motherhood, the very things that defined a woman's purpose in medieval society. The vow of obedience meant submitting her will entirely to the abbess and the rules of the order, relinquishing all personal autonomy. The vow of poverty meant possessing nothing of her own, surrendering any personal possessions or future inheritance. For a woman who yearned for a family, for the touch of a husband, for the laughter of children, this monastic life could feel like a living death, a profound emptiness that no amount of prayer or spiritual exercise could entirely fill. The spiritual solace offered by faith might be difficult to grasp when your presence in the convent was born of societal constraint rather than divine inspiration. Furthermore, the convent, while offering protection from the dangers of the outside world, the constant threat of violence, the harsh realities of poverty, the precariousness of life for unattached women, also presented its own form of confinement. News from the outside world would be scant and filtered. Visits from family would be rare and strictly supervised, often conducted through grills or parlors designed to prevent intimate contact. The emotional and intellectual world of the nun shrank to the confines of the cloister, her companions the same group of women, their lives dictated by the same unwavering routine. There was little opportunity for personal growth in the worldly sense, no chance to forge a new path, to create a unique identity outside the collective. Her existence was subsumed into the identity of the community, her individual hopes and dreams slowly withered by the unyielding structure of monastic life. The very respectability of the convent, the halo of sanctity that surrounded it, also served as a powerful barrier. Once a woman took her vows, there was no turning back. To leave the convent was to incur the gravest of spiritual penalties, to be branded an apostate, an outcast from both the church and society. It was to invite eternal damnation and worldly condemnation. Thus, for Elara and countless women like her, the decision to enter the convent, however reluctantly made, was a lifelong commitment, a path from which there was no honorable or safe retreat. It offered security and a measure of dignity, yes, but at the cost of personal freedom, self-determination, and the very possibility of living a life of one's own choosing. It was a life of quiet resignation, a grim acceptance of a destiny shaped by economic realities and societal pressures, rather than by the fervent stirrings of a spiritual heart. Her existence, while perhaps peaceful, was forever muted, her voice a silent prayer echoing in the long, cold halls. Number 2, remaining a dependent within the family home. Imagine a world where your very existence, your right to food, shelter, and even respect, hinged entirely on your marital status. In 1062, for women, marriage was not merely a social custom. It was the fundamental economic and social contract that determined their place in the world. A married woman, while still subject to her husband's authority, gained a household, a role, and a degree of security. She managed the home, raised children, and contributed to the family's economic well-being. But what of the woman who, for whatever reason, could not marry? For many, the only option was to remain a dependent within her natal family's home, a situation that could be profoundly grim, stripping away her autonomy, her potential for personal fulfillment, and often her very dignity. Consider the fate of a woman named Elara. Perhaps her family was not wealthy enough to provide a dowry for more than 1 or 2 daughters. Perhaps she suffered from a physical disability or illness that made her less desirable as a bride. Maybe she was simply considered plain or lacked the connections that might have introduced her to suitable suitor. In a society where marriages were often arranged for political or economic gain, a woman's individual charm or wit counted for little if she brought no tangible assets to the union. So Elara remained, growing older under her parents' roof, than perhaps her brothers or even the roof of a married sister. She became known as an unmarried woman, a spinster in waiting, her very designation a label of her societal failure. Life as an unmarried dependent was a precarious existence. While she might avoid the physical perils of the outside world, she traded them for a different kind of imprisonment, one of diminished status and relentless obligation. Her position within the household was ambiguous. She was family, yet not quite. She was neither a wife nor a child, neither a mistress nor a servant, but often a blend of all the least desirable aspects of these roles. Contributions were expected but rarely acknowledged, her voice unheard, her opinions dismissed. Her days would be filled with an endless litany of chores, often more arduous and less respected than those performed by the married women of the household. Eliana might be tasked with the most repetitive and tedious work, spinning raw wool or flax into thread, a never-ending cycle of twisting fibers by hand or with a spindle to produce the yarn necessary for weaving cloth for the family's garments. This was back-breaking work, dull and often performed in poor light, leaving her hands rough and stained. She might also be responsible for grinding grain into flour using a heavy hand mill, a laborious process that strengthened her arms but also filled the air with dust, making her cough. Preparation of meals, the tending of the hearth, the cleaning of the modest home, the carrying of water from the well, these were all her domain. Crucially, these tasks were unpaid. Eliana had no independent income, no coin of her own to spend or save. Every piece of clothing, every mouthful of food, every small comfort was provided by the grace of the head of the household, whether her father or brother. This complete financial dependence stripped her of any bargaining power, any ability to assert herself. She was a guest who never left, a burden who had to earn her keep through constant, unceasing labor and unquestioning obedience. Her very presence was a reminder of her family's inability or unwillingness to secure her a husband, a silent accusation hanging in the air. Her social standing was profoundly low. In a society where family was everything, an unmarried woman was anomalous, outside the established order. She had no husband to speak for her, no children to secure her legacy, no household of her own to manage. She was often viewed with pity, sometimes with suspicion, and frequently as little more than a perpetual servant. Her advice might be ignored, her presence overlooked in social gatherings, and her desires considered irrelevant. She became a silent observer of the lives of others, her own life a stagnant pool, while the rivers of family and community flowed past her. The emotional toll could be immense. Imagine watching younger sisters, nieces, or even cousins marry and establish their own homes, experiencing the joys and challenges of married life, raising children, becoming respected members of the community. Eliana, meanwhile, would remain in the background, perhaps helping to raise her nieces and nephews, fulfilling a maternal role without any of the recognition or love that came with being a true mother. She would be the perennial aunt, the quiet helper, the one who was always there but never truly seen. Loneliness, regret, and a profound sense of unfulfillment could become her constant companions. There was also the ever-present risk of being seen as a burden. As her parents aged, or as her brother's own family grew, her presence might be resented. She might be subtly, or even overtly, made to feel unwelcome. Her meals might become smaller, her clothing older and more threadbare, her sleeping arrangements less comfortable. Her value diminished with every passing year, as her youth and potential for marriage faded entirely. There was no social safety net for her, no pension, no independent means of support. Her security was entirely contingent on the benevolence, or at least the tolerance, of her relatives. Furthermore, an unmarried woman lacked the legal protections afforded to a wife. While a wife was still legally subordinate to her husband, she was generally protected by his status and her position within the household. An unmarried woman, however, was incredibly vulnerable. She had no male protector in a world where might often made right, and where women were seen as possessions. She was susceptible to exploitation, abuse, and even violence, with little recourse. Complaints might be dismissed, her suffering ignored, as she had no powerful advocate to speak for her. The grimness of this choice lay in its slow, grinding erosion of the self. It was a life of quiet desperation, of unfulfilled dreams, and of a constantly diminishing sense of self-worth. She was a shadow in the corner of a busy household, a silent presence bearing the weight of societal expectations and personal disappointment. Her days were marked not by achievements or personal growth, but by the endless repetition of tasks, the quiet shame of her unmarried status, and the profound, aching absence of a life that was meant for her, but which she could never claim. The world moved on, but she remained, fixed in a position of permanent dependence, her future as bleak and unchanging as the stones of the hearth she so diligently cleaned. Number 3, becoming a hired laborer or servant. For women in 1062, marriage was the primary conduit to social and economic stability. Without it, the options narrowed sharply, and for those without family wealth or a ready dowry, the path often led to a life of arduous labor, not within the relative security of a family home or a convent, but in the unforgiving world of paid service. Becoming a hired laborer or servant was a grim choice because it subjected women to a life of ceaseless toil, extreme vulnerability, and a crushing lack of social standing or future prospects. It was a life lived on the very edge of survival, where a single misfortune could plunge them into destitution. Imagine the story of Morwen. Perhaps she was the daughter of a landless peasant or a craftsman who had fallen on hard times and could no longer support his children. Maybe her parents had died young, leaving her an orphan with no one to care for her. In a world without social welfare systems, a woman like Morwen had to find a way to feed herself, to keep a roof over her head, and to simply exist. No dowry, no family wealth to fall back on, and no religious calling, her only recourse was to sell her labor, her very strength and time, for meager wages. Types of work available to women like Morwen were physically demanding and often unpleasant. If she lived in the countryside, she might become an agricultural laborer, working on a lord's domain or for a more prosperous farmer. This meant long days spent in the fields, from dawn until dusk, regardless of the weather. She would participate in the back-breaking work of sowing seeds, weeding crops by hand, scaring away birds, and most intensely, harvesting grain with a sickle during the brief, frantic weeks of autumn. Her hands would be calloused and cracked, her back aching, her body constantly weary. She might also be responsible for milking cows, tending to pigs, gathering firewood from the forests, or collecting wild edibles. The work was seasonal, meaning periods of intense activity followed by lean times where work was scarce, and hunger a constant companion. For those in more urban areas, or for those seeking year-round employment, domestic service was a common path. Morwen might find herself working in the household of a wealthier peasant, a merchant, or even a minor noble. Here, her duties would be endless and varied. She would rise before anyone else, lighting the fires, sweeping floors covered in rushes that hid dirt and vermin, carrying heavy buckets of water from the well for washing and cooking. She would spend hours over a hot hearth, preparing simple meals, stirring pottage, baking bread. She would clean clothes by beating them in cold water, often using harsh lye. She would spin wool, mend garments, and attend to the children of the household. There was no end to the work, no moment of true rest, and often no privacy. The conditions of service were often harsh. Servants were typically at the mercy of their masters and mistresses, who held absolute authority over their lives within the household. Wages were incredibly low, often barely enough to cover the cost of basic food and a simple change of clothing. Sometimes wages were not paid in coin at all, but in kind, a share of food, a place to sleep often on the floor or in a shared loft, little better than a stable in old clothing. There was no job security. A servant could be dismissed at a moment's notice for any perceived slight or inefficiency, leaving her instantly without sustenance or shelter. Socially, a hired laborer or servant occupied the very lowest rung of society. They were seen as property, or at best, as temporary chattel. They had no rights, no voice, and no respect. They were often addressed with brusqueness, their feelings disregarded, their individual identities subsumed by their function within the household or on the land. They were essentially invisible, a pair of hands to perform labor, rather than a person with hopes and dreams. The vulnerability of women in service was particularly acute. Without the protection of a husband or family, they were exposed to exploitation. The threat of physical abuse from a master or mistress was ever present, with little legal recourse for a servant. Sexual exploitation was also a grim reality for many young female servants. Without a husband or family to defend her honor, a female servant was tragically easy prey. If she became pregnant, she would almost certainly be dismissed, cast out into the world with no support, facing starvation, and her child branded illegitimate with no prospects. Such a fate was truly a death sentence for many, pushing them further into the depths of desperation. There was little to no upward mobility for a woman like Morwen. She could not inherit land, she could not acquire wealth through trade, and she had no means to improve her lot. The future was a continuation of her present, a life of relentless, poorly compensated labor until her body gave out. Sickness or injury meant certain destitution. As she aged, her strength would wane, making her less valuable as a laborer, further diminishing her already precarious existence. There was no retirement, no savings, no safety net. Old age meant the risk of begging, of starvation, or of dying alone and forgotten. The emotional impact of such a life was profound. Morwen would carry the burden of constant physical exhaustion, the ache of hunger, and the gnawing fear of destitution. Her life offered little joy, little respite, and certainly no personal fulfillment. She would witness the lives of others, perhaps the children she cared for, growing up with more opportunities and comfort, while her own life remained static, defined by its hardship. She might dream of a different existence, of a husband and children, a small patch of land, but these would remain distant, impossible fantasies. This grim choice was not about freedom, but about survival. It was a life stripped bare of dignity, of choice, and of hope. It was a testament to the sheer desperation faced by women who found themselves adrift in a world that offered them no independent place, forcing them into a relentless cycle of labor simply to exist, until their bodies could no longer sustain the effort, and they vanished, unremembered, into the unforgiving currents of history. Number 4. Residing as a prostitute. In the stark realities of 1062, for women who were unable to marry, with no family to depend upon, no convent to accept them, and no means to secure respectable employment, the path to survival could descend into the most desperate and perilous of all options: prostitution. This was not a choice born of freedom or desire, but a grim, brutal necessity, a last resort in a world that offered little mercy to unattached and vulnerable women. To become a prostitute was to forsake all social standing, to invite constant danger, and to face a life that was almost invariably short, brutal, and utterly devoid of dignity. Consider the hypothetical plight of a woman named Elara. Perhaps she was an orphan, cast out of an indifferent relative's home. Maybe she was a widow without a dowry, or a young woman who had been seduced and abandoned, her reputation irrevocably ruined in a society that valued female purity above almost all else. In a world where a woman's worth was intrinsically tied to her honor and her ability to bear legitimate children within marriage, Lyra's societal value was already shattered. No other means of support, no skills beyond domestic labor which she might not be able to secure, and no safe haven, the relentless gnawing of hunger and the terror of homelessness would drive her to the unthinkable. Life as a prostitute in the 11th century was utterly unforgiving. There were no designated brothels, as we might understand them today, nor any form of regulation or protection. Instead, women like Lyra would ply their trade in the shadows, in alleyways, at the fringes of markets, near taverns, or sometimes from a single, rented room if they could afford it. Their existence was marginal, always at the very edge of respectable society, if not entirely beyond it. Every day was a struggle for survival, a constant negotiation for the next meal, the next night's shelter. Earnings were meager, barely enough to cover the basic necessities of life. There was no security, no promise of a future beyond the next transaction. Each encounter carried immense risk, the risk of violence from patrons, of robbery, of disease, and of constant harassment from passers-by or even the authorities. A woman in this position was viewed as utterly disposable, without rights or protection. The physical dangers were immense. Violence was a constant companion. Men, often emboldened by drink or the prevailing societal view of these women as property, could inflict beatings, injury, or worse, with little fear of consequence. If Lyra were to be robbed or seriously harmed, there would be no one to report it to, no law enforcement that would take her plight seriously. She existed outside the law, a pariah in the eyes of justice. Disease was another ever-present threat. Without any understanding of hygiene or the transmission of illness, and with no access to medical care, sexually transmitted infections would have been rampant and devastating. Simple infections could quickly become fatal. Cold, a fever, an untreated wound could easily lead to death, as there was no one to care for her during times of sickness. There was no comfort, no nursing, no respite from the relentless grind of survival. Social ostracization was complete. Lyra would be shunned by almost everyone in society. Respectable women would cross the street to avoid her. Children might be warned away. Her existence would be a constant reminder of societal shame and moral judgment. She would have no community, no friends in the traditional sense, only other women forced into similar desperate circumstances, sharing a grim camaraderie born of shared hardship. This profound loneliness, this complete severance from the fabric of human connection, would have been an emotional burden as heavy as any physical one. The legal status of a prostitute was non-existent. She had no property rights, no right to protection, and could be arrested, flogged, or banished at the whim of local authorities or church officials, who often viewed her as a source of sin and corruption to be purged. There was no escape from this cycle. Once a woman embarked on this path, her reputation was irrevocably destroyed. There was no path back to respectability, no chance of marriage, no hope of a different life. The future was simply a continuation of her desperate present, until illness, violence, or old age claimed her. The life expectancy for a woman in this position would have been tragically short. Constant exposure to violence, disease, malnutrition, and the elements would have worn down her body rapidly. She would age quickly, her youth, which was her only real commodity, fading with each passing year. As she grew older and less desirable, her ability to earn would diminish, pushing her further into the depths of poverty and despair. Many would have died young, alone, and forgotten. This choice was not merely grim, it was a profound descent into the abyss of human suffering. It was a life defined by fear, violence, and utter degradation. For Lyra, it was a constant battle for survival, waged with her own body as the only weapon, in a world that saw her as less than human. It was a testament to the absolute lack of alternatives for women in 1062, forcing some into an existence so utterly devoid of hope and dignity that it truly represented the last, most terrifying gasp of desperation in a society built on the strictures of marriage and family. Number 5. Attempting to live as a wise woman or healer on the fringes. For women in 1062 who found themselves without the option of marriage and without the security of family, convent, or even stable employment, another exceedingly grim path, albeit one offering a semblance of independence, was to attempt to live as a wise woman or healer. This choice, while potentially providing a vital service to the community, was fraught with extreme danger, suspicion, and perennial social isolation. It was a life lived on the very edge of societal acceptance, constantly shadowed by fear of accusation and persecution, a grim autonomy purchased at a tremendous price. Imagine the story of Isolde. Perhaps she was a woman with an innate understanding of plants, a keen eye for observation, and a gentle touch. Maybe she had inherited knowledge from a grandmother or a village elder, learning which herbs could soothe a fever, which poultices could draw out infection, or how to assist during childbirth. In a world without formal medicine as we know it, where doctors were rare and expensive, especially for the common folk, such knowledge was invaluable. Isolde might have been called upon by her neighbors, her skills desperately needed when sickness or injury struck. However, her position was inherently precarious. Power came not from the sanctioned authority of the church or the feudal lord, but from her connection to nature, and a knowledge often passed down through generations of women. This made her both indispensable and deeply suspicious. The church, consolidating its power, viewed any practices outside its direct control with skepticism, often labeling them as pagan or even demonic. Superstition was rife, and fear of the unknown ran deep in people's hearts. A woman who could ease suffering could also, in the minds of the fearful, be capable of inflicting it. Isolde's independence, however limited, set her apart. She lived outside the traditional structures of marriage and family, which immediately made her anomalous and potentially dangerous in a society that valued order and conformity above all else. She owned no land, had no husband to protect her, and no children to connect her to the community in the expected way. She might live in a small, solitary hut on the outskirts of the village, or deep in the woods, making her an outsider, a figure whispered about. Her livelihood was based entirely on the goodwill and desperation of those she helped. Payment might come in the form of food, a few coins, or practical goods, but it was irregular and uncertain. She lived from hand to mouth, relying on the success of her remedies and the gratitude of her patients. The patient died, despite her best efforts, the blame could easily fall upon her. A child's unexplained illness, a cow's barrenness, a bad harvest, all could be attributed to the wise woman's ill will or dark powers, rather than natural causes. The greatest grimness of this path lay in the constant, terrifying threat of accusation. In an age of pervasive belief in witchcraft and evil spirits, fueled by the teachings of the church, a woman like Isolde was always vulnerable. A failed cure, a misunderstood word, or the simple malice of a jealous neighbor could quickly escalate into charges of sorcery. Chroniclers and church records, even from this early period, contain instances of women being accused of illicit practices, often associated with healing or fortune-telling. While the full-blown witch hunts were centuries away, the seeds of suspicion were already sown. An accusation could mean banishment, imprisonment, or even a trial before a local lord or ecclesiastical court, where the outcome was often predetermined. Confession, extracted through various means, was often sought, and punishment could be severe. Even if Isolde managed to escape such a fate, the stigma of suspicion would cling to her, further isolating her. People might still seek her help in secret, but public trust would be eroded, and her life would become even more solitary and fearful. The social isolation was profound. While she might be respected for her skills, she was rarely truly accepted. She would not be invited to village feasts or celebrations. Her opinions on matters other than health would be disregarded. Her advice might be sought, but her company avoided. She lived in a constant state of vigilance, watching for signs of fear, resentment, or official disapproval. Her relationships were transactional, based on need, rather than genuine human connection or affection. This was a life of profound loneliness, punctuated by moments of intense pressure when someone's life lay in her hands. She carried the weight of her knowledge, but also the burden of the suspicion it generated. She had a purpose, yes, a vital role in her community, but it came at the cost of personal safety, social belonging, and emotional peace. For Isolde, the choice to be a healer was a desperate bid for autonomy, a way to survive and find meaning outside the traditional confines of marriage and family. But it was a fragile autonomy, constantly threatened by the very society she served. Her knowledge, her only asset, was also her greatest danger. Her life was a testament to the limited, often perilous, options for women in 1062, where even a path of service and healing could lead to an existence marked by fear, isolation, and the ever-present shadow of persecution.